definitely.
Okay, okay. I'll do that after any preliminaries that we have.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Maren, I think we can start. Maren?
Morning, everyone. Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our international conference, which discusses discourses based on interdisciplinary practices. And today we have our first keynote session led by Professor Scott Slovic, who is the chair of the Department of Idaho, University of Idaho from the US. And we are really happy to have you here, Professor Scott, sharing your views on the Arithmetic of Compassion as a case study of interdisciplinary scholarship. And I invite our head of the department, Dr. Neil Abraham, to officially introduce the keynote speaker and let them name for the talk. Over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Maren, and Professor Slovic. Apologies for the slightly wrong affiliation. Dear Professor Scott Slovic and members of the Department of English and all the participants and paper presenters. Professor Scott Slovic is the Distinguished Professor of Environmental Humanities in the University of Idaho, USA. He served as the founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, and from 1995 to 2020, he was the editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, a central journal in the field of eco-criticism. He has published more than 300 articles, interviews, op-eds, and reviews, and is the author, editor, or co-editor of 27 books, primarily in the area of eco-criticism and environmental humanities. But I was especially fascinated by his book, Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data, which was published in 2015. Much of his current research focuses on data studies, that is, how information is collected, communicated, and processed cognitively in the context of humanitarian and environmental crises. He serves as an advisor and contributor to the Arithmetic of Compassion website. And this website, it's a unique initiative by a group of academics which aims at, I quote from the website, overcoming obstacles to action in the face of the world's most urgent problems. The mission of the Arithmetic of Compassion website is to raise awareness of the psychological obstacles to compassion, including psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficiency, and the prominence effect. These are terms, these are emerging terms, and I'm sure the professor would be speaking about that during the course of his talk. These cognitive biases lead to inaction in the face of some of the world's largest humanitarian challenges, including genocide, famine, and climate change. And his books include the forthcoming edited volumes, Nature and Literary Studies, which will be brought out by the Cambridge University Press, and the Bloomsbury Handbook to Medical Environmental Humanities. He was just telling us about that. Professor Slovic, with your expertise and credentials, we know that it was really sweet on your part to spare time to spend with us in the middle of your hectic schedule. And thank you. Even now, we know that okay, you're in your hometown, Eugene, Oregon. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We are indeed delighted and honored to have you with us. So, Professor Slovic, without further ado, may I invite you to deliver the lecture on the Arithmetic of Compassion as a case study of interdisciplinary scholarship, cognitive psychology, the environmental humanities, and social needs. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mini, and thanks to everyone else who's involved in organizing this conference. I appreciate your work in arranging for this lecture and for the rest of the conference. And I'm happy to be able to talk with you a little bit this morning, your time, about the Arithmetic of Compassion project. So I'm going to share my screen, and offer some slides to you. And there should be time after my presentation for some comments or questions and answers. So let me do the share screen right now. Okay, let me see. Getting weird. Let's see. Can you see my screen now? Can you see the slideshow?
Yes, yes. The white screen.
You have a white screen. Do you now see my slides? Can you see my slides at the moment? Hello?
No, the screen is blank, Professor.
It's blank. That's really strange because I'm sharing my screen. Let's see. I see my slides. I'm going to stop and try it all over again.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Okay. Wait a second. I see the blank. I see the whiteboard. I don't want the whiteboard though. Let me see. Oops. Okay, can you see my screen now?
No, Professor, no, not really. Perhaps.
Oh, wait a second. Wait a second.
Yeah.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
It's a little out of focus. Now it's okay. Now it's okay.
Right. Let me.
Perfect. Okay.
I'm going to put it on the slideshow mode. Can you see it now?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay. Good. Okay. So actually, this first image here is of a work of art by the famous digital composition artist and photographer named Chris Jordan. And a little bit later in my lecture, I'll be discussing a series of images by Chris Jordan called Running the Numbers, where he attempts to convey the relationship between small things and large phenomena, between the individual and the many. And this particular work of art, which is called Plastic Bottles 2007, is an example of one of Chris Jordan's well-known works of art that seeks to overcome the human insensitivity to large-scale phenomena, which is one of the key themes of the Arithmetic of Compassion project that I'm going to be talking about. So let me try to advance my slides. Let me see. Oh, okay. So the focus of my talk will be the psychological and environmental humanities aspects of the Arithmetic of Compassion website, which was started in the year. It seems that I keep receiving information on my screen about people who are entering the waiting room, and it's kind of blocking my view of the slides, but I'll attempt to remove these from my vision. Oops. Sorry. In 2016 is when we created the website. And this is the URL for the website, just arithmeticofcompassion.org. And the website was created as an offshoot of the 2015 book, Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data, which I compiled together with my father, a psychologist named Paul Slovic. And you heard a little bit about this book in the introduction. So first we created the book, and we spent about 15 years gradually compiling the book and deciding how to structure the book and what kinds of psychological ideas and environmental humanities ideas needed to be included in the book project. And then after publishing the book, we wanted to find a way to connect the ideas, the fundamental ideas or research products of the book to contemporary issues in the world. We felt that the theories and the discoveries of the book were directly relevant to many important worldly challenges. And we felt that a website might enable us to constantly update the information and demonstrate applications to things that were happening in the world. So I'm primarily going to talk about the website in my lecture, but first I wanted to introduce some of the fundamental ideas in the website which emerged from the earlier book. So the book is Numbers and Nerves. This is an image when my father and I spoke at the University of Oregon, where my father is a professor of psychology, shortly after the book was published. And some of the key ideas in the psychology of insensitivity to important information are indicated on this slide, such as psychic numbing. Psychic numbing is an idea from the in the mid-20th century, developed by the psychologist Robert J. Lifton, who was doing research on survivors of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, Japan, and he found that survivors of this overwhelming event, which was just kind of mind-blowing and had not been experienced by anyone in the world previously, tended to numb their sensitivity. And for the survivors of this extraordinary phenomenon, the nuclear bomb, psychic numbing was a survival strategy. It enabled them not to be completely devastated by the experience and to go on with their lives. However, what we're finding these days is that we tend to be numbed by information. When we receive information about large phenomena, and this means phenomena larger than the number one, the human mind tends to fall into a kind of numbness and insensitivity. And this leads to what we might call a tragic insensitivity to significant phenomena. Because as soon as many people are imperiled by a catastrophe of some kind, we care less and less as the numbers grow larger and larger. And I'll talk about some examples of this in a little while. So psychic numbing means basically turning off our sensitivity and not caring, not feeling compassionate as the numbers grow larger. Pseudo inefficacy means a false feeling of not having any ability to be effective in responding to a crisis of some kind. Because the reality is, when there's a crisis, we can almost always have a certain degree of efficacy or effectiveness, but we feel ineffective when the phenomenon is so large that we worry that our contribution might be a drop in the bucket and not help very much. So if we feel we can't help everyone in need, if there are a number of people in crisis, we are less inclined to help anybody at all. And so we call this pseudo inefficacy, because the reality is we can always make a positive difference, even if we can't help everyone equally. And then the prominence effect refers to the competing values that may lead to distraction from our core values and to a kind of inaction. So, for instance, we may care about climate change and want to live a lifestyle that will not contribute to global climate change, and yet maybe we also need to travel from our home to our work or to our university, and thus we are willing to burn fossil fuels in order to get from one place to another. And that, so the value of transportation competes with another set of values that make us wish not to cause further global climate change. And we have to weigh these different values and determine how to behave. And this sense of competing values is what we call the prominence effect. The asymmetry of trust, also studied by empirically through research projects by cognitive psychologists means that there's asymmetry, an imbalance in the way we build trust and the way we undermine trust. It's very easy to break down trust or erode trust, and it's very difficult. It takes a long time to gradually build a sense of trust in certain kinds of information. And this is why it's so perilous for there to be skeptics about climate change who are trying to advance particular political or economic interests, because it's really quite easy to puncture any sense of public trust, and quite a challenge in order to build back that trust. The same thing could possibly be said about trust in pandemic vaccines. It's rather difficult for the scientific establishment to build public trust in the power of vaccinations. And on the other hand, all it takes is a few people who have other interests to criticize the validity of vaccinations, and many people in the public will find that their belief or their trust in the power of medical science will be eroded. There's also the idea in the book Numbers and Nerves of the anesthesia of destruction, that certain types of language that emphasize technical terminology or the large numbers of phenomena that are at risk can easily have an anesthetic or numbing effect and enable some of the forces of destruction, like industrial projects or the burning of fossil fuels for energy, to proceed, because we in the public are anesthetized or made numb or uncaring due to the kind of language used to describe these phenomena. So we need poignant, individualized stories to overcome the numbing effects of the kind of data or information used to describe large-scale phenomena. And then the phrase transscalar imaginary comes from the artist Chris Jordan that I mentioned earlier with my cover slide. That was one of his images of many plastic bottles. It looks like an abstract image until you see specifically what he's representing there. And the transscalar imaginary describes the ability that Chris Jordan and many other people think we need to have in order to move imaginatively across scales, from the one to the many, from the individual to the collective. And in the modern world, where so many of the crises and urgent situations that we ought to be trying to understand are on this large planetary scale, or certainly a larger scale than the individual level, we have to find a way to use our minds in order to move back and forth across these scales in a transscalar fashion. And so Jordan and other writers and artists have suggested that art, including various other forms of communication, not just visual art, but literature and even music and film, might help us to train our minds in order to move between the large and small scales. That's what transscalar imaginary refers to. So the phrase arithmetic of compassion actually comes from the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, who published a poem in 1974 called Mr. Cogito Reads the Newspaper. It comes from a book of his titled Mr. Cogito, who's a fictional character that the poet has created. And obviously, cogito means thinker, or to think. And so Mr. Cogito's the style of thinking is what the poet Herbert is exploring in this poem. And here you see the character, Mr. Cogito, is reading a fictional newspaper. And in the newspaper, there are a couple different stories. There's the story of a large-scale devastating situation where many soldiers are killed in a wartime event, 120 soldiers, in fact. And alongside it, on the front page of this fictional newspaper, is a story of a single family and a terrible, tragic crime involving just one family. And the story of the murderer. And this poem studies the way Mr. Pogito's mind responds to the large-scale information of the wartime event and the much more specific narrative of the single family that has undergone this crisis, where a 30-year-old farm laborer who was depressed has killed his wife and two small children. And as you read the poem, you see that Mr. Cogito does not pay much attention to the story of the 120 soldiers because it doesn't grab him emotionally. And he's much more fascinated with the story of the farm laborer and his family. And so the story of the many soldiers, this is the end of the poem, doesn't speak to the imagination of Mr. Cogito. There are too many of them. The numeral 0 at the end of 120 changes the soldiers into an abstraction. And then the final lines of the poem by Herbert are a subject for meditation, the arithmetic of compassion. This is where we get the phrase that we use in the book, Numbers and Nerves, and we also use it as the title of the website that I'll be talking about. And it has to do with the arithmetic, means the mental processing of information related to compassion, whether we can actually feel a strong sense of attachment to the subject or whether we cannot follow that very closely. So obviously, this is a conference or a series of lectures you're listening to on interdisciplinarity. And I'm trained in the humanities. My field is literary studies and creative writing and the broader field of the interdisciplinary environmental humanities. My father is a cognitive psychologist, and in doing the Numbers and Nerves and Arithmetic of Compassion projects together, we found ourselves bringing together cognitive psychology and the environmental humanities. And so early in the book, in the introduction, in fact, we quote Zbigniew Herbert's poem, and then we layer our two disciplinary views on top of each other. And the blue statements here are my own from a humanities point of view, and the red statements are my father's psychological interpretations of the poem. So the fact that the poet writes about the report on the first page of the newspaper I write indicates importance. And then the brief mention of the killing of 120 soldiers I write in the blue here shows that the statement is perfunctory and vague, a summary, not an image. It's devoid of emotion. These are the kinds of things that a humanities scholar might notice. When the poet mentions that the war lasted a long time, my father, the psychologist, writes, duration leads to normalization and accommodation. That means acceptance. And then you could get used to it, and thus a loss of attention. And I notice as a writer and a humanities person, the word you, the second person pronoun, and that word engages and challenges the reader. And then getting used to is something that implies that the poem is concerned with a lack of sensitivity. So we started our project by looking at this poem about the arithmetic of compassion and literally layering our different disciplinary perspectives on top of each other in reading the poem. And this is what the page in the book looks like from the introduction, where you can see in boldface the actual language of the poem, and then SS are my initials, and you can see my responses and to the poem, and PS refers to my father's psychological responses. So literally, you see the two disciplines coming together in responding to a key poem representing the idea of the arithmetic of compassion. This is just a kind of symbolic representation of the merging of disciplines. So Mother Teresa once famously stated, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." And this is one of the key statements representing psychic numbing. When we try to consider a large number of people or other beings in crisis, we are not moved to act. But when we see an individual person or an individual example of any other kind of phenomenon, we might well be moved to engage in some kind of positive or constructive action. Mother Teresa's observations actually demonstrate something deeply unsettling about human nature that are at the heart of psychic numbing. Most people are caring and will exert great effort to rescue the one whose needy plight comes to their attention, but they will not act to help the many. And the psychologists and environmental humanities scholars like me are interested in understanding why this might be the case and what can be done about it. In other words, how might we be able to make people aware of this tendency in their own cognitive processes so that we can actually push back against this tendency as we experience it in our own lives, and perhaps feel more sensitive to the plight of numerous individuals, not just human beings, but other individual phenomena that might require us to intervene in somehow, in their plight somehow. And how can we communicate about various types of crises in order to overcome the human tendency towards psychic numbing? So there's the question about how we should value the saving of human lives or other phenomena that we believe too important. A normative model suggests, I mean, this is the best case scenario about how we think we probably should use our minds, how we should process information, suggests that every life is equally important. And there should be perhaps a linear relationship between the number of lives in question and the value of saving those lives. That suggests that we don't value any lives more than any other lives. Either that or another normative model suggests that as the number of lives in question increases the value of these lives. So there should be an upward exponential curve. And this is because large losses threaten the viability of the group or of an entire society. This is true certainly not only of human beings, but if you know anything about pollinators, such as honeybees, that we are facing an ecological phenomenon known as critical colony collapse due to the use of pesticides and loss of habitat, so that large numbers of honeybees may be in danger. And when they're threatened, the fact that so many honeybees are in danger means that their importance is even more significant. It should rise upward in an exponential way rather than merely being a linear rise, because we are at risk of losing entire populations of honeybees and bats and other pollinators. But a descriptive model of the way the human mind actually values lives as we receive information about the number of lives that are in danger is that there's a rapid decline of sensitivity to the value of these lives. And this decline of value actually begins when we move from 1 to 2. We're highly sensitive to individual phenomena. and psychologists sometimes refer to this as the Singularity Effect. And we immediately begin to become less sensitive to these phenomena as soon as we start talking about two phenomena rather than one. So that by the time we're talking about 10 people who are struggling rather than one, or 100 or 1,000, we're caring vastly less for the larger numbers than we are for the individual. Some people refer to this, psychologists refer to this as psychophysical numbing. And it shows how quickly phenomena become abstract for us. It's really quite a shocking aspect of the way the human mind works. This is a picture of my father in his office. And he writes in the introduction, or in the article that he contributes, one of the articles to the book, Numbers and Nerves, our capacity to feel is limited. Psychological research depicts a form of psychic numbing that is not beneficial. Rather, it leads to apathy and inaction, consistent with what is seen repeatedly in response to mass murder and genocide. So the tendency towards psychic numbing helps to explain why we are so inactive, and even why our governments are so inactive when large-scale devastation occurs. So we are highly sensitive to some information and insensitive to other information. One very vivid example of this has to do with the refugee crisis that many of us have been reading about over the past decade or so. And around the time when the book Numbers and Nerves was published in 2015, the Syrian civil war had produced numerous refugees fleeing that war, and often trying to make their way to Turkey and then eventually to Europe. And there were many stories in the media about this refugee crisis, often depicting large numbers of refugees in boats, or in this case, there's a boat that has capsized on crossing the waterway between Syria and Turkey. And this is from The Economist, the major British newspaper. There are people floating in the water, others are on top of the capsized boat. This resulted in very little response from the public, seeing the large numbers of people in this perilous situation. But on September 3rd, 2015, this other photograph of a 3-year-old child named Elan Kurdi, he has a name, he has a face, he tragically died while his family was trying to cross the sea to Turkey. This is a Turkish rescue worker approaching him. This photograph of Elan Kurdi captivated the public and resulted in an enormous surge of public attention to the Syrian refugee crisis, and also resulted in substantial amounts of donations to philanthropic organizations helping refugees. So here's an example from Google Analytics showing that there was kind of a modest amount of attention to refugees and Syria as search terms on Google. And in fact, up until September 3rd and the publication of this photograph, no one was searching for the name Elan. But as soon as that photograph was published and the story of Elan and his family was published, there was an immediate surge of searching for not only the name of the child and his family, but for the larger phenomenon of refugees and Syria. So a sudden captivation of the public with this story as a result of the individual information, individualized information rather than collective information. So what I'm particularly interested in as a humanist, humanities scholar, is the issue of poignancy, or the compelling presentation of information, which I hope might have a powerful political effect and can empower local individuals to tell their stories, or to help other people represent certain types of crises that require public attention and political attention from decision makers I'm interested in how we might make that information more poignant. And that's a large part of what I'm going to be discussing in a few examples of artistic communication. So here's the artist Chris Jordan, who offers us the phrase, the transscalar imaginary. He's the one who also showed us that image of many, many plastic bottles in order to try to sensitize viewers to plastic contamination, plastic pollution, which is a huge issue, particularly in the world's oceans, which are now filled with not just plastic bottles, but vast swirling masses of microplastics. It's actually a major ecological crisis. And so Jordan uses digital imagery, digital compositions that he creates on these computers, and then he prints them out on a very large scale printer. And these are displayed in art museums and on his website. You can see the link to his website at the bottom of this slide, chrisjordan.com. And particularly the series of images that he calls running the numbers represents his effort to do a special type of composition in order to illustrate the relationship between the singular and the multiple, the individual and the many. And he often will represent very familiar images, such as the one that he's standing near on the left, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, which he recreated digitally out of plastic images of plastic bags. And he uses a very specific number of these bags representing the amount of waste produced in a single day. So these are pictures that I took in his studio in Seattle, Washington, when I was visiting him in around 15 years ago in order to interview him for the book Numbers and Nerves. I included several interviews with well-known writers and artists, including the writer Vandana Shiva from India. That's why I was in New Delhi around, I forget what year, I think it was maybe 2006 or so, in order to indicate the writer Vandana Shiva for the book Numbers and Nerves. Jordan is interested in training the minds of his viewers in order to understand the transscalar imaginary. So if you look at the images on the left, the top image shows the distant view of plastic bottles 2007. 2007 is the year 2007. The caption to that image is that it depicts 2 million plastic beverage bottles, the number used in the United States every 5 minutes back in 2007. And as you walk closer to the image, you see that it's not an abstract scene of small dots, but it's actually individual plastic bottles with the names of the companies and the types of drinks on them. And so if you were viewing Plastic Bottles 2007 in a museum, you could walk up close to it and see the near view of the individual bottles, and then you could walk away from it and see the collective view of the bottles. If you see this on Jordan's website, you click your cursor on the image and it moves toward you. And then you click again and it moves away. So you experience this transscalar view, but whether you look at it online or see the physical composition in a museum. In the interview that I did with Jordan for the book Numbers and Nerves, he tells the story about being in an art museum in Colorado with a friend of his who's actually holding a plastic bottle of water in his hand as he looks at this image. This seems like it must be fictional because it's too unlikely or too perfect to have actually happened, but I think it did actually happen. And his friend undergoes a kind of conversion experience as the transscalar imaginary actually starts to work in his mind, and he realizes that he's holding a plastic bottle, which is such a problem, because of all the pollution that it creates. And he says, well, I'm only holding one bottle. It's not really a big ecological problem. Then he looks at Jordan's work of art and his head kind of snaps back and he says, I just understood the point of your piece. It's 2 million one bottles. And that everyone who's holding a single bottle is thinking, this is only a single bottle. It's not going to cause a huge ecological impact. But the reality is all of us together and our consumption processes are creating this tremendous crisis in the world. So Jordan is attempting to communicate this with visual art. Other artists are writers. And another person that I interviewed for the book Numbers and Nerves is the prominent Mexican poet and novelist and essayist Homero Oregis, very, very famous Mexican writer. And one of his poems is about the endangerment of gray whales, a species of whale that is facing extinction. And in writing a poem about the gray whale, instead of writing about multiple whales, he writes about a single whale, imagining a future when there may be no more gray whales left swimming in the oceans. And so intuitively, and Regis understood the poignancy of vulnerability. Again, reaching toward a sense of emotional poignancy for his audience, rather than writing about the entire species of gray whales, he addresses directly in a kind of apostrophic way a single gray whale, perhaps the final member of its species. And he tries to imagine what it would be like when there are no more gray whales. And the fact that he's writing only to one final vulnerable gray whale makes this piece particularly poignant. Another example of the use of singularity is in the famous work of environmental writing by Aldo Leopold, the classic American environmental writer, in a piece called Thinking Like a Mountain, which appeared in his book, A Sand County Almanac, one of the most famous works of American environmental literature from the mid-20th century. And in fact, in this short essay, Leopold describes the experience of when he was a young man and working as a natural resource ranger in the American Southwest. He thought that, well, it was his job to protect habitat for deer and other animals that American hunters would like to find. And he thought his job was to remove predator species from the ecosystem, such as wolves. And so he tells the story of how he and a colleague came across a pack of wolves and immediately began firing their guns at them. And finally, they walked up to an older wolf that they had shot. And as he did so, he watched a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. And he realized that he had made a tremendous mistake. He had a kind of conversion experience, understanding that wolves and other predators are necessary to a healthy ecosystem. But in writing about this memory, he tells the story of a single wolf and watching her eyes change as she dies. And this particular phrase, a fierce green fire, it has become one of the classic phrases in American environmental literature because it's so poignant. It would not be so poignant if Leopold were writing about a whole group of wolves that he watched dying. The fact that he writes about only one wolf and her eyes makes this much more powerful due to the effectiveness of singularity in making us care about a vulnerable phenomenon. And then he moves on later in the essay to scale up to the broader ecological picture. So he moves from the individual wolf to the larger picture of the role of wolves and other predators in an ecosystem. And this is a kind of a demonstration in literature of what Chris Jordan is trying to do with his visual art of scaling up from the small to the large. And Leopold doesn't move back and forth in a transscalar fashion, but he does demonstrate a type of transscalar thinking in the way he presents this famous essay, Thinking Like a Mountain. Another example of talking about a large phenomenon in terms of specific individual victims is from the 2015 Nobel Prize winner in literature, the Belarusian author Svetlana Alexievich, who in one of her well-known books tries to represent the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl by presenting an oral history. And essentially what she does is tell the stories of individual workers and other victims of this disaster. Rather than focusing on large-scale data or statistics, she presents the large phenomenon by way of individuals. And here you see an example of her language. She's writing about a deceased fireman in the voice of the fireman's wife, as she's describing what it was like for him to experience radiation poisoning following exposure to the nuclear disaster. So, even in some very well-known literary texts, we see authors intuitively sidestepping insensitivity to large-scale phenomena by way of certain communication strategies. So Edward Tufte is a specialist in the visual communication of quantitative information and what kinds of strategies we need in order to communicate data effectively. And he suggests in a book of his on visualizing data that what we need is a multi-dimensional approach, that we can't just rely on one strategy. We can't just present the numbers or just present the single examples of these large phenomena. We need essentially to do everything at once. We need a balanced approach, and so essentially this means we can try to overcome the psychological tendencies toward insensitivity to large-scale phenomena by using images, narratives, personalized stories and faces, and by understanding the psychological processes by which we respond or fail to respond to information. This is the fundamental thinking for the Numbers and Nerves and Arithmetic of Compassion projects. So what types of written language and other modes of communication can have dramatic impacts on audiences? Well, certain types of narratives seem to be especially capable of achieving poignancy. One is to reduce large-scale phenomena to individuals or singularities. Another is to move back and forth between the singularities and the scaling up to the bigger picture, or the fluctuation back and forth between large and small scales. Stories of vulnerability tend to be particularly poignant. So, in fact, stories involving imperilment or even death or disappearance are particularly moving to us. And then stories that reveal dramatic change, such as a conversion of some kind. And this is what we get in the Aldo Leopold example I gave you earlier, where the young ranger experiences a deep change of heart as he makes a realization about the importance of predators in ecosystems. And that dramatic change is particularly moving and memorable to audiences. So I've been using some of these ideas in my recent research on environmental humanities responses to the COVID pandemic. And I've been particularly focusing on the way the pandemic has given all of us a chance to experience vulnerability, or what some people such as Pramod Nayar from the University of Hyderabad call precarity or eco-precarity in a particularly powerful way. So I've been trying to think of ways to actually study the relationship between literature and a positive, powerful sense of vulnerability that might make us more mindful of other forms of vulnerability aside from the pandemic. So actually, I'm currently designing empirical experiments. That means experiments that will collect data using various psychological concepts such as emotional contagion and mortality salience in order to test what I call narrative contagion, how it is that a story or a narrative might actually infect readers or viewers with a sense of their own precarity, which will make these people who experience such stories more sensitive to other types of vulnerability that we experience when we damage planetary ecosystems. And I'm doing these new experiments with a young communication studies expert from the University of Oregon named David Markowitz. And so working interdisciplinarily with a scholar from psychology and communication studies to try to study the impact of narrative. So now let me turn to the website for several minutes and give you some examples. There are currently 112 blog entries on the AOC website, which bring together explanations of key psychological concepts with key ideas from the environmental humanities in response to current and historical global crises. So at the beginning of the website, we offer descriptions of key psychological terms like the ones that I mentioned to you earlier, psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, and the prominence effect. And then also we go into key concepts from the environmental humanities, including slow violence, narrative empathy, and empirical eco-criticism, the use of empirical psychological methodologies to study the effects of stories on audiences. An important emphasis of the website is the application of psychological and environmental humanities concepts to the world's most urgent problems. As you heard in the introduction before I started speaking, that the website is not merely a presentation of the results of fundamental research, but an effort to apply these ideas to all kinds of urgent situations in the world, both humanitarian and ecological crises. So I'm going to give you some examples of small essays or other types of writing that I have prepared among the 112 pieces in the blog section of the website. I've written maybe 12 to 15 of these, and various other colleagues have also written many of the other blog entries. So once you begin thinking about the arithmetic of compassion, which means the ideas that I've been talking about in this presentation, I think you'll start to see applications to many real world situations in your own lives, or as you read the newspaper or receive information through other sources. So my first blog essay for the website, which I wrote around 2016 or so, was when I had visited Dhaka, Bangladesh, in order to give a lecture there, and I visited the museum, the Civil War Museum in Bangladesh at the end of my stay, and came across the American poet Allen Ginsberg's poem about the Civil War in Bangladesh called September on Jessore Road, in which he writes about the large numbers of people who are forced to flee their homes due to the devastation of the war. And he attempts to use various strategies to overcome the vastness of the scene of devastation and suffering by writing about specific individuals. And in the poem, he very self-consciously comments on how difficult it is to appreciate the large scale of the phenomenon during this war, and how the human mind can really only grasp the individual examples of suffering. And so I wrote a small essay about the experience of visiting this museum and reading the poem because it's relevant to the arithmetic of compassion. In 2019, I wrote an article for the website, for another website, I wrote about the use of storytelling to foster empathy between competing groups in the context of public policy. The essay is called Bright Words, Finding Common Ground in Environmental Negotiations. And then we included a short description of the other article that I had written on the Arithmetic of Compassion website. Another short essay touches upon psychic numbing, slow violence, and narrative empathy in the context of environmental toxicity, showing how poetry can help make stories of contamination poignant. So I write about a specific book of poetry focusing on mining contamination and the effects on public health, and mining and the slow leakage of the destructive chemicals from mining into the drinking water of the community cause very subtle and gradual public health problems. And so key ideas such as psychic numbing and slow violence emerge by way of this poetry, which makes us feel empathetic toward the individuals who suffer this kind of a public health crisis. Some of the Arithmetic of Compassion blog entries seek to draw attention to other relevant publications, such as this note that I wrote concerning an article on wolves, the victim of police violence, George Floyd, and the limits of human empathy. It's a study of empathy. And so we also use the website to try to call attention to other relevant publications that explore how we might communicate in order to raise public awareness of and empathy toward underrepresented, voiceless communities, including non-human communities. So he's interested in not just human beings, but in animals such as wolves. Here's a review that I wrote of a recent film called A Private War, which details the life of war correspondent Marie Colvin, whose goal was to break through psychic numbing by telling the stories of people suffering from war and civil unrest. So another use of the website, and especially the blog section, is to draw attention to other media in which people who have tried to break through psychic numbing are represented. And my most recent blog entry for the website, again, drawing together ideas from both the environmental humanities and cognitive psychology, is an interview that I did with a prominent American author named Sharman Apt Russell, who earlier this year published a book on childhood malnutrition called Within Our Grasp. And so I asked her about various aspects of her work that are related to these psychological and environmental humanities concepts. So I'm just about at the end of my talk, and I wanted to offer a few final points. So there's various challenges and virtues of interdisciplinary collaborations that I came to understand by working with my father on Numbers and Nerves and the Arithmetic of Compassion project. First of all, sometimes it feels difficult to force yourself to do this type of work because you're trained in a particular field, and it may seem much easier just to stay within your disciplinary comfort zone and not find the time to forge ahead in another discipline and actually force yourself to learn ideas from other disciplines and read technical articles in the other field in order to work on a combined interdisciplinary project. But you really have to kind of compel yourself to do that. As I mentioned, it took 15 years for us to put together the book Numbers and Nerves. Meanwhile, we were working on many other projects in our specific fields, but we really had to force ourselves to turn to this project. You need to learn enough to make help about each other's field, to make helpful comments on the work that you're each producing, even to take the lead sometimes in commenting on the importance of ideas and language from each other's discipline. So I guess in a sense, you have to, when you're working interdisciplinarily with colleagues, you have to be willing to listen to the ideas of someone who may not be trained in your field, but who wants to comment on and analyze and offer suggestions about your work. So it takes some open-mindedness to accommodate feedback from outside of your own discipline. You also need to have the opportunity to ask an expert, to realize that you have the opportunity to ask an expert whether your ideas make sense. So when I'm using psychological concepts, I will ask my colleague, in this case, my co-author, Paul Slovic, about the psychological concepts I'm using, and he will turn to me and ask for examples of writers who are exploring important psychological ideas. So to realize that we can take advantage of the insights from experts in the fields that we're working in. And as we were working on this project, we found that we came to enjoy it so much. We didn't want to publish because we were so enjoying our work together. And that's another reason why, after publishing the book, we then created the website Arithmetic of Compassion in order to continue this work together, which we've now been doing for another 6 years. So although it can be challenging to do these sorts of interdisciplinary projects, I find that on balance, it's quite rewarding, quite exciting, an opportunity to learn new things. And I hope that people who look at the book Numbers and Nerves and at the website Arithmetic of Compassion feel as if our various fields, the environmental humanities and cognitive psychology, are coming together in useful ways. So with that, I'm going to stop my presentation, and if any of you have any questions, I'm very happy to listen to them and try to give some answers.
Thank you, Professor Slovic, for this amazing instance of hands-on practice of interdisciplinarity. Thinking of transscalar perspective, transscalar imaginary, as you termed it, I was wondering if we could invert the lens from the victims of mass violence.
I'm sorry, your voice is cutting out a little bit.
To the perpetrators of mass violence. Okay, just. Am I audible now?
Now you are. Thank you.
Okay. So, so I was wondering about your concept of transscalar perspectives, and see if we could invert the lens from the victims of mass violence to the perpetrators of mass violence. Like in the case of the study by Hannah Arendt, when he studies the Holocaust trials in Nuremberg and Eichmann in Jerusalem, she subtitles her work as the banality of evil, because a lot of people who were tried for their violence couldn't just understand why they were singled out. Of all the people who were killing and looting, they couldn't just understand why they were singled out and tried and punished for it. And to take a recent example from Indian context, we had a very scandalous rape incident in Delhi. And given how rape and sexual violences were normalized in a certain society in Indian state, the main perpetrator of the violence, even as he was tried and put in jail, couldn't just understand why he was the only one punished. And he said, everybody in this particular state does it. Why am I being the one who's punished? Because there was a lot of media attention on him. His face was all over the media, and he couldn't just wrap his head around it. So I was trying to see the parallels between psychic numbing from the side of the victims and consumers of violence to the banality of evil from the side of the perpetrators of violence. Yes.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. And I do think that we can use the ideas of psychic numbing and singularity in particular in order to try to understand that maybe we should not be numb to this type of violence that you're describing and consider it banal or ordinary, and that by focusing on the individuality of the perpetrator or the person who commits a crime like this, we may become more sensitive to the kind of individual who participate in this type of violent action. And again, I agree with you that a trans-scalar type of thinking is necessary to move from the individual perpetrator to the idea of many people performing this type of terrible violent action. It does, the risk is that we might feel as if we only need to bring a single perpetrator to justice, and it's an individualized phenomenon. And what we need to do is to be able to scale up from the one person who's brought to justice and imagine how many other people must be not only brought to justice, but educated. I think on a larger scale, that, if indeed it's a more common phenomenon than we even know about, that doesn't even make its way into the courts, into the legal system, we have to understand that the process of scaling up from the individuals who are brought into the legal system and accused of these crimes to the many other people who may be performing these types of violent actions and not brought to justice. You're exactly right that it requires a scaling up, and so I think, what I was talking about is not only relevant to victims of various types of violence, human and otherwise, but also to perpetrators of these situations. So I don't know that I have too much more to say, but it may be that there's it would be possible for artists or other communicators to represent villains in the same way that I was describing victims.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just like to make an observation in addition to what Rose has said. You were talking in terms of the singular versus multiple, in terms of how people react to, shall we say, tragedies, or the fact that individual stories are much more powerful than the collective ones. I just thought that Judith Butler, in one of her articles on radical equality, she talks about the difference between grievable lives and ungrievable lives, non-grievable lives. She was writing in the early days of the pandemic, when vaccinations were not quite available, and the governments were making policies as to who should be vaccinated first, and there was this major discrimination as to whose lives are worth saving and whose lives are not worth saving. So I mean that in terms of policy making, these numbers, or rather the governments, they take certain decisions based on who's more important and who's less important, based on a lot of parameters. And and you referred to Pramod Nair and his references to eco-precarity. He has that is in relation to the environment, and he has also talked in terms of precarity, precarious lives, etc. And he was writing about the long walk. That means in the early days of the pandemic, when everything was shut down, there were a group of migrant laborers who were stuck, and they had to walk hundreds of kilometers to reach their hometown because they had absolutely no access to anything. And as you said, it did not inspire too much sympathy because it possibly was a collective story. I mean, similar to your term of psychic numbing, etc. I think there was a term called compassion fatigue, because we were, inundated with so many stories of, sadness and tragedies that we were kind of completely numbed. So this also, I read somewhere Pramod Nair quoting that. It's not his term. It is somebody else's term, compassion fatigue. So
Yes.
It's just an observation.
You're exactly right. Yeah, no, compassion fatigue is a common term. It is definitely related to psychic numbing. And journalists tend to refer specifically to compassion fatigue as a concern in their work. And so I think it's a constant challenge for communicators of all kinds, whether we're talking about artists or journalists or teachers, when we're trying to help people to pay attention and understand phenomena that we feel are important for them to remain attentive to or to become attentive to, we have to break through a kind of psychological crust of insensitivity. And it's very dangerous, when we begin to experience compassion fatigue, especially during a phenomenon like the pandemic, when all of us are susceptible to this kind of fatigue. It's hard to feel constantly vigilant and concerned. People are restless. They feel, during lockdowns and other situations, we're forced out of our happy lives and the way we prefer to be living, and we feel this urgent need just to not be worried all the time and not be completely attentive to the plight of other people. It can be overwhelming. The same thing is true, I think, of healthcare workers, certainly in the United States, but probably in India as well. People are just overwhelmed by the numbers of patients and people who are in desperate situations, and it's very hard to be sympathetic anymore. And I think probably something that needs to be studied is how we can rebuild our reserves of empathy. How maybe we need to step aside and not think about these situations for a time in order to make ourselves able to become sensitive again. And so I think, once we are fatigued or we've spent whatever reserves of compassion or sensitivity we might have, we just need to take a break from experiencing these emotions. Otherwise, inevitably, this may be true across cultures, I think, inevitably we will lose our capacity for sensitivity. And so I think, in a sense, we kind of need, sometimes when eating a meal, we need to take a drink of water and cleanse our palate in order to appreciate whatever it is we're eating again. The same thing may be true of our minds when it comes to being sensitive to information. We may need to kind of cleanse our minds in order to be able to experience compassion in a renewed form. But the story of the workers who were in India who were forced to travel great distances, that I think, and also what you mentioned about the differential valuation of lives, depending on who the victims might be or who those in a plight may be, is a very interesting and important question. But I do think the potency of singularity can, to some extent, overcome certain prejudices that people might have regarding the grievable lives and the less grievable lives, that to some degree the singular example almost always breaks through and is moving to us because of the potency of the individual story, even if we're from a completely different social group than the people who are represented in a large story, a mass event. If we're told the story of one individual member of that group, it's likely to break through and move us in some way. And it may be true of other species as well, because of the way our minds have evolved. I think we have evolved to focus on small scale phenomena, often individual phenomena. And probably there are, in evolutionary psychology, there are ways of explaining the reason for this evolution. But the reality is the world has changed. In fact, we have changed it through our technological progress. We have created a different world. And so one of the books that I lean on heavily in some of my own work is a book by the population biologist Paul Ehrlich and the psychologist Robert Ornstein called New World, New Mind Toward Conscious Evolution. It's a book from 1989. Again, it's called New World, New Mind. And their point is that we cannot force our brains to evolve biologically in a biophysical sense any faster than they will naturally evolve, but we can consciously create a kind of evolution in our way of thinking so that we become more sensitive to large-scale phenomena or other types of phenomena that are the result of the world that we have produced. And so, things like global climate change, microplastics pollutions, the toxification of ecosystems, mass extinction. We're living in the middle of a mass extinction event that people call the sixth extinction. So we're losing many, many species of plants and animals around the world right now, every day. These phenomena we cannot see visually or with our other senses. We cannot experience them. We have to gather the information in more abstract ways, and then communicators need to find ways to pierce our insensitivity and make us care about these phenomena that we can't actually sense with our own physical senses. It's just the world that we live in right now. And if we're not sensitive to these phenomena, if we don't care enough about them and create policies that might begin to mitigate the damage, we're very likely to see a terrible spiral of the ability of the earth to continue to support us, a downward spiral. And so that's why it's so crucial that we find ways to communicate this information meaningfully so that the public becomes more aware and concerned of these phenomena, and that we work with our political representatives in order to try to develop wise policies.
Thank you. I mean, I'd just like to make a small comment on the talk by Teresa Cordova yesterday. You just spoke about the evolution of the mind. So she was talking about the increasing delegation of human judgment to artificial intelligence. So that part kind of effectively puts a stop to any evolution that might take place, because we've stopped thinking, we are delegating our judgments increasingly towards AI. Teresa was talking about it yesterday.
Yeah, I think that's true. I've been talking with a lot of people today, even about artificial intelligence, but I think maybe we can determine the proper arenas for AI, and then the other arenas in human life where we need to retain control over decision-making processes. So we can't delegate everything, and we need to try to use good judgment about where we use AI and where we use human intelligence. But I have to say, human intelligence is often not very intelligent. It's not that it doesn't set a very high bar or high standard for intelligence, and often we are not able to make very good decisions. But if we recognize that in ourselves, and in fact, that's a lot of what I've been talking about today, is certain various failures of the human mind to be sensitive in situations where we know we should be more sensitive. So it's possible that we could program the machines that we rely on for artificial intelligence to be wiser than we are ourselves. And so that AI would make better decisions if we program the computer systems to respond to phenomena that we know are serious. We know these are large-scale phenomena that we're likely to be insensitive to, that maybe an AI system would be more sensitive than the human brain to existential crises, let's call them. And in that case, perhaps it would actually be valuable to delegate existential crises to AI systems rather than relying on our own flawed sensitivities.
Okay, thanks. If anyone else would like to ask a question, they can unmute themselves or they can type in the chat box. I mean, that's a very positive observation you made, Professor, about delegating, because as you said, AI can be programmed to be more sensitive than us or sensible than us. That would be good. But usually people look at it with a sense of foreboding. At least the humanities scholars look at it with a sense of foreboding. But I think the other disciplines, I'm not sure. Even if we are in a seminar on interdisciplinarity.
Yeah. Well, I think, we need to try to be open-minded. And yeah, as I said, I'm a humanities scholar, but much of what I've learned from psychology suggests that the human mind is both fascinating and in various worrisome ways flawed, and we need to be aware of that. And and I think a lot of the work that I do aspires to contribute to what Ehrlich and Ornstein refer to as conscious evolution. Let's make ourselves aware of our limitations in order to try to improve our abilities. I wonder if there's a question in the chat box. Oh, it's just a good morning. Okay. Yeah. Well, do we have just a few more minutes? I think we're going to 9 to 11 your time.
Yes. Yes. If there are no more questions, I think, Marin. Jaisar, can you unmute Marin? I think she's there. Right. Marin?
Yes, am I audible now?
Yes.
So, Professor Scott, that was a very insightful and amusing session indeed. And that too permeated with very relatable and interdisciplinary instances. You spoke about psychic numbing, as to how human mind falls into a state of tragic insensitivity towards the most critical situations in life, and how poignancy and training in transcalar imaginary, a training to view the individual amidst the collective, can to a certain extent pave a way out of the terribly apathetic situation. The discussion on numbers and words and its basic concept, the call for a balanced, multidimensional approach, was quite an eye-opener. So thank you so much, Professor, for accepting our invitation to be the keynote speaker today, and all the very best for your new projects based on the narrative completion. So thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you, Marin.
Thank you, dear participants, for being part of this keynote session. Our next session will be at 11:30 a.m. It should be led by Dr. S. Chitra, the program leader in the Department of English at Yonphula University, Bhutan. And the talk will be on ecopolitics and the green points of Bhutan. Hope to see you for that session. So thank you so much.
Professor, it was an absolutely wonderful session. You gave us so many insights. Thank you. Really, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Recording stopped.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Very nice to see you, and thanks for giving me the chance to give a presentation. Okay. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Professor, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Hello, ma'am.
Chitra, ma'am. Hello.
Good morning.
Morning. Were you there in the session, ma'am? Or
I will be.
Yeah, yours is at 11:30, I think, right? It's not
No, I will be joining the chair. No.
Yes, you have a chairing session. So I think I've sent you the links.
Links I received. Abstracts I have not received, but I will listen to them and comment. It's okay.
Okay.
I will join in Google Meet.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you. This is just for the benefit of some of the participants who are joining now. The session by Professor Scott Slovic, it just got over, and the next keynote is at 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and that would be by Professor Jacques Gouillot of the University of Paris. And meanwhile, we shall be having the paper presentation sessions. And for the paper presentation sessions, we are holding it on Google Meet. because the links have been already shared in the WhatsApp groups. So may I request the paper presenters and the participants to join the technical sessions in which you are interested. So the participants, please join the appropriate session in which you have been slotted. And if there is an audience, or if you would just like to participate in the technical sessions, please go through the schedule which has been shared and try to